Hello, my dear friends. Women in the Middle Ages could die rotting from the inside without anyone knowing. They lived in winters so cold they couldn't touch water, wore dresses stained with blood and bodily fluids for months, and took the stench for granted. But what happened underneath their dresses was often more horrific than anyone could imagine. Babies grew up smelling of pus and feces, midwives had to use knives to cut open rotting skin, and sometimes bodies were hastily buried simply because the smell was too strong. Tonight, you'll still lie with them as we quietly peel back the frozen layers of medieval winter hygiene. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to stand in the middle of a medieval village during the heart of winter, they would understand why bathing was almost unthinkable. The air was sharp enough to sting the skin, and the wind cut through layers of wool and linen like knives. Water froze in the buckets before it could be brought inside. Fires burned weakly in the hearths, barely enough to warm a single room, let alone a full tub of water. In that kind of cold, undressing completely was a dangerous act. The idea of pouring cold water on bare flesh was not only unbearable but deadly. People accepted the grime on their bodies as part of survival, the same way they accepted hunger and darkness. Inside those wooden houses, smoke from the hearths mixed with the smell of damp clothes and animal fat. Steam never rose from bathtubs, because few homes had any. The cold seeped into walls, into skin, into bones, until every breath felt like inhaling ice. Most families kept a single bucket for all household needs, and during the winter, it often turned to a solid block before dawn. The women of the house would scrape thin layers of frost from the inside and melt it by the fire for cooking, never for washing. It is almost ironic how cleanliness became a luxury, while filth was the only thing that could keep them alive. When someone dared to attempt washing, it was a ritual of suffering. A cloth would be dipped in tepid water, rubbed quickly across the neck, arms, and face, then hung to dry near the fire. The same rag would be reused for days until it stiffened with dirt. A full bath was seen as something foolish, the act of someone who did not value life. Even nobles, with their larger fireplaces and extra servants, rarely indulged in washing during deep winter. Warmth meant life, and to remove clothing meant inviting death. The streets outside were no better. Frost clung to everything, from the stones to the wooden doors. When people passed each other, the smell of unwashed bodies filled the air, but no one flinched. Odour was as natural as breath. The layers of wool, linen, and fur that kept them alive also trapped every trace of sweat, smoke, and animal grease. If one were to imagine a perfume of the Middle Ages, it would smell of soot, fear, and frozen sweat. The stench was a constant companion, dulling the senses until it became invisible. Villagers learned to clean themselves without water. Some used coarse cloths or old bread crusts to scrub the skin, believing the roughness helped remove dirt. Others rubbed ash or crushed herbs into their bodies, hoping the dry powder would absorb oil. The results were poor, but at least it was something. They said it made the skin feel lighter, though in truth it left behind another layer of dust. The body never felt clean, but it felt less frozen. Women bore the greater burden. They had to care for their families, cook, and sleep near the same fire that dried their washing. Their hands were cracked, their nails blackened by soot, their hair stiff from days without rinsing. Even if a woman found the courage to heat a pot of water, there was no place to bathe in privacy. The wind that entered through cracks in the walls turned every attempt into misery. The best she could do was wipe her face and arms before bed and thank God she survived another day without freezing. It is difficult not to feel a certain pity when imagining that warmth itself had to be rationed like food. Water was both life and danger, It could quench thirst or steal heat from the body within minutes. Some chroniclers wrote of travellers who tried to wash in rivers and were found the next day. Their skin turned grey, their hands frozen to the edge of the ice. Such tales were warnings told by mothers to their daughters. Cleanliness was not a virtue in winter, endurance was. The dirt on the skin became a shield, the smell a sign of survival. The people who smelled the strongest were often the ones who lived the longest. Bathing, in their eyes, belonged to the warm months. Winter was for keeping one's body sealed, wrapped, and guarded. The human form was hidden beneath cloth and fur, and for those long months, even the thought of bare skin felt distant, almost indecent. Touching water was like touching death. There was no shame in filth, only fear of the cold, and fear ruled everything. By the end of each winter, many bodies bore the marks of this neglect. Skin cracked, rashes spread, and infections grew quietly beneath layers of fabric. But no one spoke of it. Illness was too common to name. The cold dulled not only the flesh, but also the will to care. When spring finally came, washing became an act of renewal, as if the body itself had survived a long burial under frost. The villagers had learned one rule above all: never challenge the cold. To do so was to invite death into one's home. And so, they lived through those months with the grime of daily life pressed close to their skin, carrying the proof of their endurance like armour. The cold had its own rules, and everyone obeyed. Bathing was not forbidden by law, but by nature itself. No one questioned it. They simply endured, each day blending into the next in a haze of smoke and frost. The season left behind its scars in silence, and the people accepted them as the price of survival. When water turned to stone and fire lost its strength, even the smallest act of washing could mean ruin. Somewhere beyond that frozen acceptance, another kind of suffering was waiting, one that grew quietly beneath their layers of wool and cloth, hidden but never gone. Under the weight of winter, clothing became a second skin that no one dared to shed. The women of medieval villages owned only one or two undergarments, often made of coarse linen that scratched the flesh when new and clung to it like damp paper when worn for too long. Each piece carried the mark of daily life, absorbing sweat, oil, and the invisible weight of labour. Changing them was almost impossible. Washing them meant risking the body to the cold, standing by a frozen stream, or handling icy water that bit through the fingers. The fabric stiffened in the frost, and once it dried, it was pulled back on, still carrying the memory of the skin it had just left. The idea of freshness belonged to warmer months. In winter, the fabric itself seemed to rot slowly against the body, turning from pale grey to dark brown where it met the skin. The smell grew stronger each day, a blend of smoke, sweat, and something sour that no one named. It is strangely darkly humorous that people fear demons in the night, but not the slow decay beneath their own clothes. The undergarments were meant to shield, but they became a cage that trapped everything the body tried to shed. Women folded themselves into those layers each morning, as if wearing the same fabric could keep the world predictable, even as it turned foul. Near the hearth, the daily ritual repeated itself. After the day's labour, a woman might remove her linen briefly, holding it close to the fire's faint warmth. She would scrape away the visible dirt with her nails or rinse the fabric with a little water, only enough to make it appear lighter. Then it was left to dry beside the soot-blackened stones, where the smoke settled deep into the threads. When the fabric stiffened from heat, it was considered clean enough. She would press it between her hands to soften it slightly, then pull it back on before sleeping. There was no luxury of replacement. The same linen touched her every day, from first frost to thawing spring. The mixture of bodily fluids turned the fabric into something alive. Blood from menstruation, discharge, and sweat left stains that no washing could erase. Mould crept along the seams in the most humid corners of the body. Yet these were not seen as signs of uncleanliness, but as part of existence. What mattered was warmth, not purity. The body adapted, The nose forgot, and survival outweighed disgust. If one were to compare this to modern life, it would be like wearing the same underwear for an entire season and calling it a victory against the cold. In those dim rooms, the smell was constant. It mixed with the scent of smoke and burnt fat, clinging to the walls and the straw beds. No one spoke of it because everyone smelled the same. There was no shame in stench, only the shared understanding that survival demanded compromise. Women rubbed herbs or ashes into the fabric to dull the odour, but the relief lasted only moments. The cold made washing not only painful but futile. Within a day, the damp cloth would freeze again, and the body would sweat beneath it, repeating the cycle. The stitching of these garments told stories of endurance. Torn seams were repaired by candlelight with thick thread, and the edges were burned by the fire to seal them. Some pieces had been handed down from mother to daughter, thinned by time but still considered precious. It was not the quality of the garment that mattered, but its existence. A woman who had a spare piece of linen was considered fortunate. Most could only dream of it while pressing their one garment against the fire, praying it would dry before morning. Frost often formed on the inside of homes, coating walls and bedding in thin white crystals. In that biting air, taking off even one layer meant trembling for hours. The undergarment became part of the body, moulded to its curves and creases, marked by every moment of labour and rest. When illness came, it stayed close to the skin. When wounds opened, it soaked them in silence. There is something quietly tragic in how the very fabric meant to protect a woman also consumed her comfort piece by piece. Doctors of later centuries would describe the infections that spread from such conditions. But in the Middle Ages, no one spoke of them. The pain between the thighs, the sores that refused to heal, the itch that kept women awake at night, were endured without question. To complain was to seem weak, and weakness was shameful when survival itself demanded hardness. The body adjusted to neglect, just as the mind adjusted to cold. To remove those garments completely was an intimate act, reserved for washing in secrecy or for childbirth. Even then, the cold air bit at the skin so sharply that women hurried to cover themselves again. The boundary between clothing and body blurred, until one could no longer tell where warmth ended and filth began. The fabric carried the scent of the person, the house, and the winter itself. When spring returned, and the first wash in running water was possible, the garments sometimes tore apart from sheer age and wear, yet no one mourned them. They had done their duty by keeping their owners alive through the coldest months. Winter in the medieval world was not about cleanliness but endurance. The filth that gathered was not seen as failure but as proof of strength. The garments that trapped it were relics of necessity, soaked in the evidence of a life fought against the elements. To discard them too soon was to forget how much they had endured together. They wore their endurance like a second skin, and it held them through the darkness of the season. When the frost finally began to retreat, the weight of those linens told the story of months spent hidden from the world. Yet beneath that quiet decay, the body still breathed, waiting for warmth to return, for the chance to remember what it felt like to be clean again. The season wrapped every woman in the same fabric of survival, binding filth, warmth, and patience into one. When the ice began to loosen and the rivers started to run again, their clothing would tell the story of what they had suffered to stay alive. But just beneath that fabric, something deeper was waiting, something that would turn survival itself into a burden no one dared to name. Hair in the medieval winter was never just hair. It was a layer of protection, a nest of warmth, and at the same time, a breeding ground for what no one wanted to name. Women tied it tightly, sometimes in thick braids, sometimes wound beneath a scarf that had not been washed for months. The cold made every drop of water a threat, so no one dared to wet their hair. Instead, they coated it with animal fat, most often mutton tallow, to keep it from tangling and breaking. When fresh, it softened the strands and trapped heat close to the scalp. But as the weeks passed, the mixture of sweat, grease, and smoke formed a crust that clung like wax. It hardened with dust and flakes of skin, until the hair itself felt heavier than the head beneath it. Inside those layers of fabric and oil, life thrived. Tiny lice and fleas burrowed into the roots, laying eggs that hatched unseen. The itching never stopped, only dulled when the skin grew numb with cold. The scalp broke into small sores, hidden beneath braids that no one dared undo. To unbraid the hair meant facing the smell, the sight of what had been living there. It is almost grimly funny that the very fat meant to preserve beauty turned each head into a small, living farm of parasites. No one called it filth. It was just winter, the way everyone lived, even among the nobles, whose hair was perfumed and wrapped in silk. The same infestation waited beneath the surface. The poor and the rich shared this quiet misery equally. When a woman sat near the fire, the warmth released the scent trapped in her hair. It was thick and animal-like, mingled with smoke and sweat. Children slept close to their mothers, breathing in the same smell every night. The house became its echo. Hair caught every odour that passed through those narrow rooms: burnt bread, tallow smoke, the sour breath of sickness. Washing was a dream for another season. If one imagines the modern world, it would be like never washing one's hair through the entire winter, yet calling the smell of grease and dust the smell of home. The warmth of the scalp mattered more than cleanliness, and the more oil it held, the safer it felt. Combs were rare, often shared by entire families. They were made of wood or bone, the teeth dulled with time. Each stroke through the hair carried not only dirt but living things. Lice eggs clung to the wood, and when another person used the same comb, the colony spread. Still, people continued the routine. They combed in silence, resigned to the crawling sensation that never truly ended. A mother might pick through her daughter's hair by the dim light of the fire, crushing the lice between her nails, wiping them on her apron. It was a gesture of care, not disgust, part of daily life that no one questioned. In the dark corners of the scalp, oil mixed with ash from the hearth. Some believed this combination protected against frostbite. Others thought it repelled evil spirits. What it truly did was seal the pores, turning the skin grey and thick. When the temperature dropped low enough, the fat stiffened, forming a film that cracked when touched. Beneath it, the scalp festered. Small wounds appeared where fingernails had scratched too hard. Pus gathered under the crust, but the cold slowed the pain, making it easier to ignore. It is unsettling to picture these heads resting against one another at night, sharing warmth and infection in the same quiet breath. Water, when available, was used only for drinking or cooking. Washing hair was an extravagance. The thought of pouring cold liquid on the skull was unbearable. Even steam could cause faintness in rooms without proper ventilation. The only cleaning came from rubbing in flour or powdered herbs, which absorbed some of the grease before falling away as clumps. For a brief moment, the hair looked lighter, less slick, but within a day, the natural oils returned, heavier than before. Travellers passing through villages described the smell as part of the air itself. They wrote of rooms so close and smoky that the odour of hair burning near the fire mixed with that of cooking fat. No one noticed. Smell was not a warning. It was existence. The human scent was part of survival, proof that warmth still lived beneath the layers. To lose that smell would mean something far worse, a body turning cold. In wealthier homes, servants sometimes attempted to clean their mistress's hair by heating wine or vinegar and dabbing it onto the scalp. The liquid stung, bringing tears to the eyes. The result was only partial relief. The lice died, but their eggs remained, and the smell of sour wine lingered long after. The process was repeated every few weeks, always ending in failure. Perfumed powders were sprinkled afterward to hide the stench, but the perfume itself mixed with decay, creating a new scent entirely, a kind of sickly sweetness that filled the air during long winter feasts. By spring, the build-up of grease and soot was thick enough to make hair clump into stiff cords. Some women cut it short out of desperation, though that too brought shame, as long hair was tied to virtue. Most simply waited for warmth, for the chance to wash again in melted snow or river water. When they finally did, the first rinse turned black, carrying away months of sweat, oil, and the faint remnants of fire. The relief was brief but unforgettable, a reminder that beneath the grime, the body still belonged to them. For all their patience, these women lived with discomfort that modern people can hardly imagine. Hair, once a symbol of beauty, became a weight of necessity. It kept their heads warm while feeding the creatures that thrived on them. There was a story whispered through the halls of a northern manor about a woman whose vanity met the winter head-on. She had grown tired of the grease that weighed her hair and of the sour smell that clung to her pillow. Her servants heated water as best they could, breaking ice from the well and mixing it with the faint warmth of the hearth. When she finally poured it through her hair, steam rose for a moment, but the cold crept back before she could dry it. Her long dark strands clung to her neck and shoulders like icy ropes. By nightfall, her skin was already losing colour. The next morning, her body was stiff, and her scalp was still damp, as though the water had never left her. The villagers said she had been cursed for pride, though what killed her was simply the cold. Water and flesh were not meant to meet in such weather. Once soaked, the heat fled from the body faster than any fire could return it. Her attendants found her lying in her bed, lips blue, hands curled as if still clutching her hair. The doctor who examined her spoke of a cold in the brain, a sickness of the head brought on by washing. It sounded almost poetic, but it was only another name for death by frost. It is both tragic and absurd that something as small as a moment of cleanliness could become an act of self-destruction. Her death became a warning. Word spread beyond her household, reaching nearby villages where women shivered by their fires, clutching their unwashed hair and whispering prayers of thanks that they had not done the same. The story was retold every winter, gaining small details with each retelling the sound of the water as it poured, the shiver that ran through her, the stillness that followed. To the poor, she was a fool who had courted death for vanity. To the rich, she was a reminder that wealth could not protect against nature. The cold cared for no rank, no title, no beauty. In the silence that followed, no one in that region dared to wash their hair again until spring. Some covered their heads even indoors, afraid that a draught might find its way through the window and strike their skulls. The idea of catching a head cold grew into something more sinister, a fear that cold water could freeze the thoughts themselves. If this were to happen today, it would be like someone collapsing after a simple shower because the air conditioning was too strong. The difference is that now, people would know the reason. Back then, it was seen as punishment. The human mind, desperate for meaning, turned nature into myth. Frost became a spirit that punished arrogance, and water turned into a test of humility. A woman who bathed in winter was spoken of as reckless, even immoral. The body was sacred only when it was covered, untouched by the elements. The dead noblewoman became an unspoken lesson. Cleanliness could cost one's life. Mothers repeated her story to their daughters each year as the cold began to bite, warning them to keep their heads dry and their pride buried. Inside the manor, her room remained closed for months. The servant said the air never lost its chill, that even when the first buds appeared on the trees, the scent of dampness lingered there. Her bed was burned to rid the house of misfortune, and her comb was buried in the garden. To touch it again was to invite the same fate. In that quiet, her death became less a tragedy than a rule. The body must remain sealed in its dirt until the thaw returns. For the rest of that winter, women tied their hair tighter, rubbed it with fat until it shone, and swore they would rather smell of smoke than risk touching water. The noblewoman's death gave them permission to stop caring, to turn neglect into wisdom. Clean hair became foolish hair. Only the living carried their odour, while the clean were buried in frozen ground. I cannot help but think how strange it is that survival sometimes demands that we keep what we should have washed away. No records tell her name. She was only the lady who washed her hair. That was enough. Her story lived on longer than her body, repeated by travellers who never knew her face. To wash one's hair in the dead of winter became synonymous with madness. Even men avoided it, rubbing ash into their scalps instead. Every drip of water became a symbol of risk, every drop of sweat a sign that life still lingered. The fear lasted for generations. Each time someone complained of a headache or dizziness after standing near the cold, they remembered her. Her ghost lived not in haunted halls, but in the minds of every woman who reached for a bucket of water and hesitated. The wind outside seemed to whisper her mistake, a reminder that warmth was fragile and easily lost. Her story blended into winter itself, a caution carved into the rhythm of survival. No one ever proved the truth of it, but no one needed to. In an age where warmth and life were one, her death became part of the season's law. The cold punished those who forgot their place, and she had merely been one of them. Her fate reminded the living that comfort could kill as swiftly as the cold itself. They learned to sleep beside smoke, to smell of sweat, to fear water more than dirt, and as the snow thickened outside, another truth began to emerge from beneath the layers of grime and fear. A truth about how much pain a body could carry in silence before it broke. The body below the layers of fabric was a mystery even to its owner. Women in medieval winters learned to live without seeing or touching the parts of themselves most hidden. The cold made the thought of washing unbearable, and the fear of losing fertility was stronger than the discomfort of dirt. They believed that cold water could creep into the womb, freeze the blood, and destroy the seed of life. No mother would allow her daughter to risk such a fate. To stay warm was to stay alive, and to stay untouched was to stay whole. The area beneath the heavy skirts remained closed, both to air and to awareness, sealed in linen that never saw the light of day. They layered their clothing like armour, wrapping their bodies in wool and linen until skin became something distant. Even when the smell turned sharp, it was ignored. The body's scent was accepted as natural, a sign of endurance rather than shame. It is almost grimly ironic that women who were taught to value purity could not even reach the part of themselves most in need of care. When irritation or infection came, they whispered prayers instead of seeking relief. Pain was seen as a test, a burden to carry quietly through the frost. Inside homes, the air was thick with smoke, and the heat from the hearth reached only the nearest corners. Privacy was rare. Women could not bear themselves even to clean. The cold bit at every patch of skin exposed. Instead, they wiped what they could with bits of cloth or dry moss, brushing away what little dirt their hands could reach. Some placed herbs or leaves between their layers of clothing, believing their scent would drive away both spirits and sickness. The smell of sage or thyme mixed with sweat forms a perfume of survival. If one were to compare it to the modern day, it would be like masking the smell of decay with a spritz of perfume and calling it cleanliness. When bleeding came each month, the discomfort worsened. Dried blood clung to fabric and skin alike, and the air trapped between the layers grew heavy and damp. Yet they could not risk washing. Even the steam from hot water was thought to invite illness. The warmth of the fire could not reach beneath their skirts, and so the dampness stayed. They moved carefully, feeling the rough fabric chafe the tender skin until it burned. To touch themselves in that place was shameful, to complain about the pain even more so. Doctors, when they were consulted at all, repeated the same warnings. They spoke of the female body as fragile, a vessel that could be ruined by the cold. Women were told to protect their wombs at all costs, to keep them warm and untouched, and so they obeyed. They wrapped themselves tighter and bore the ache that came from stillness. The body healed slowly, if it healed at all. What was unseen was not considered wounded. What was hidden did not exist. Married women suffered in silence. Their husbands often demanded closeness even when infection made it unbearable. They said nothing, afraid of being blamed for coldness or disobedience. Their bodies were instruments of lineage, not comfort. Some used ashes or crushed flowers to ease the irritation, but these were only temporary reprieves. Infection grew quietly, hidden beneath layers of fabric and fear. No one spoke of it, because no one dared to. The cold silenced everything. Even the young learned this silence early. Girls were taught to cross their legs tightly when sitting, to move carefully so their skirts would not lift. The lower body was a secret, something to protect but never understand. They heard stories of women who became barren after washing in cold water, their bellies empty forever after. Fear took root, stronger than the stench or the sores. It was better to stink than to be sterile. Warmth, they said, was life itself, and water was death. The linen beneath them hardened over time. It rubbed the skin raw, left bruises where it folded, but they wore it still. Some lined it with straw for extra insulation, though the straw cut the skin when it shifted. The smell of urine and sweat thickened around them until it filled the air of every room. They learned not to notice. The human mind adapts quickly when the body has no choice. I find it haunting how a society could build its beliefs so tightly around fear that even the simplest act of care became forbidden. When the snow melted and rivers ran again, washing became possible once more. The first touch of water burned like fire. The skin beneath their clothing was pale, soft, and inflamed. Many were shocked at what they found: wounds, sores, discoloration. Some cried quietly at the sight, not only from pain but from realization. They had gone an entire season without seeing their own bodies. The cold had hidden them from themselves. Yet by the next winter the same patterns returned. The fear was too deep, the lessons too old to forget. Water still meant danger, and warmth still meant survival. The hidden parts of the body once again disappeared beneath the folds of cloth, unseen until spring returned. The price of endurance was ignorance, and ignorance was a kind of peace. Their bodies endured the cold by sealing themselves off from the world. The dirt, the smell, and the silence became their companions through the long, frozen months. When spring came, they would discover the damage done, but by then the frost had already taught them to accept it as normal. The skin healed, but the fear remained, ready to bloom again with the next chill. And in that endless cycle of survival, the body itself became a prisoner of its own protection. When winter settled deep into the bones of the land, the arrival of a woman's bleeding was a quiet calamity. There were no comforts, no clean linens kept aside, no sense that this natural rhythm deserved care. It came like an unwelcome guest, filling the cold air with worry. Women used torn cloths, old pieces of linen too worn for anything else, folded and pressed between their thighs. They could not change them often. Water was too precious and warmth too scarce. The blood thickened quickly in the freezing air, clinging to the fabric, hardening into a black crust that rubbed against the skin with every movement. There was no choice but to endure. Each layer trapped both warmth and filth, so they stayed in place for days. The odour grew heavy, metallic, and burnt, a mix of dried blood and smoke from the fire. It is almost cruelly ironic that in a world obsessed with purity, women were left to bleed in silence, bound by rags and fear. When the clothes grew stiff, they were rinsed with what little water could be spared, then hung by the hearth to dry. The smoke darkened them further, and the smell of iron mingled with soot. When morning came, they were folded again, reused until they fell apart. No one thought this strange. It was life as they knew it. The pain was worsened by the cold. Cramps tightened in the belly like a hand squeezing from within, and yet women kept working, tending fires, mending clothes, feeding others. There was no rest, no bed set aside, no sympathy. Blood soaked through layers of clothing, leaving stains that spread outward like dark shadows. Sometimes the cold made it congeal before it could flow, causing deep aches that lingered for days. If one were to imagine such a life today, it would be like facing every month's suffering in a world without warmth, medicine, or mercy. When the infection came, it began quietly. Small sores formed where the fabric rubbed against the flesh. The mixture of blood, sweat, and ash turned these wounds sour. Yet no one looked. No one treated them. Modesty was a chain that held them still. They prayed instead, asking for strength to carry what they could not clean. The smell followed them wherever they went, but in a world already filled with stench, it was barely noticed. In the poorest homes, women sometimes used straw or dried moss instead of cloth, stuffing it into the folds of their clothing for absorption. The roughness cut the skin, but at least it soaked up the blood. They burned the moss afterward if they could, but often it was simply thrown into the fire that cooked their food. The scent that rose was familiar, almost invisible in the cloud of smoke that filled every room. No one spoke of it. There were no words to describe what was too common to be shocking. Noble women fared little better. Their garments were made of finer fabric, but they suffered the same cold and the same ignorance. Servants handled the washing in silence, wringing out the stained rags into buckets and pouring the red water into the snow outside. In those moments, even wealth could not mask the reality of the body. The castle's stone walls did nothing to warm the flesh. The same chill that froze the peasants' huts crept through the chambers of queens. The fear of infertility haunted every decision. Women believed that touching cold water during their bleeding would spoil their wombs, freezing the life within them, so they avoided washing altogether. Days passed, then weeks, with the same fabric pressed to the same skin. The odour deepened, a mix of rust and rot. The mind adjusted to it, as minds often do when survival leaves no other choice. I find it difficult not to feel a deep sadness when imagining how much pain was hidden beneath those quiet layers of endurance. When the bleeding finally ended, there was no sense of renewal, only exhaustion. The clothes were rinsed one last time, folded, and kept near the fire until the next month. They were not seen as tools of care, but as burdens to be endured again and again. Women learned to predict the cycle not by calendar, but by instinct, feeling the slow tightening of their bodies before it came. They prepared in silence, because there was nothing to say. The men around them did not ask, and the church offered no comfort beyond reminders of Eve's curse. The cold made everything worse. In the still nights, women could hear the slow drip of melting snow outside while their own bodies continued to bleed unseen. Every stain became a mark of shame, every odour a reminder of helplessness. The fire burned low, casting the walls in dim orange light, and the blood that dried beside it looked black, like oil. They sat close to the warmth, holding their skirts down, praying that the next morning would bring strength to move again. By the time spring returned, their bodies bore the memory of every month's quiet suffering. The rags were thinner, their skin more tender, and yet the cycle would start again without change. The pain was no longer a shock, but a companion. The cold had taught them to treat it as something natural, like breathing in frost or waking to hunger. The body endured because it had no other choice. The mind forgot because remembering was too painful. Blood and cold became two sides of the same silence, bound together by necessity. Women lived through it quietly, hidden beneath their skirts, leaving behind no record except the stains that winter never let them wash away. Their suffering was swallowed by the season itself, disappearing into the rhythm of life that demanded endurance above all else. When the ice began to melt, they would lift their eyes to the rivers again, wondering whether the water could finally cleanse what the winter had forced them to carry. The body, wrapped for months in unwashed layers, became its own prison. Beneath the linen and wool, heat gathered in secret, mixed with sweat, and turned against the flesh it was meant to protect. The skin of the thighs, the underarms, and the folds beneath the breasts softened and broke under the constant pressure. Dampness never dried. It was trapped between fabric and body, feeding the quiet bloom of sores that began as small red spots and grew into wounds that throbbed with each breath. The women did not speak of them. They could not afford to. In the dead of winter, removing even a single layer of clothing could mean illness or death. And so the rot spread quietly, hidden from the world. The smell that rose from these wounds mingled with smoke and sweat until it became part of the house itself. When a woman moved, the air around her shifted with a faint trace of decay, but no one reacted. Everyone carried something that stank. It is almost darkly comical that people who feared demons in their sleep did not fear the rot slowly eating through their own flesh. Pain was expected. The body was a tool, not a temple. When sores burst and bled, the pus soaked into the same fabric that caused them, and the cycle continued. Those who tried to clean the wounds did so in secret. They used cold water sparingly, or the smoke from burning herbs, hoping the fumes would cleanse what they could not touch. Some tied strips of cloth around the sores to keep them from rubbing against the skin, but the bandages only trapped more moisture. The cloth hardened, tore the skin anew, and became part of the infection. They did not have ointments or antiseptics, only ashes and animal fat. A few rubbed tallow mixed with crushed herbs onto the sores, not knowing it sealed in the infection rather than curing it. The pain deepened but remained hidden, muffled beneath the weight of winter. The worst of these wounds formed in the private places, where no light ever reached. Between the thighs, the skin cracked from friction and sweat. Sitting became a torment, walking worse. The women limped through their days, hiding the pain with the same quiet endurance they used for hunger and cold. If one were to compare it to modern life, it would be like carrying an open wound beneath your clothes for months and pretending it does not exist because survival demands silence. There were no doctors to trust, no medicines to soothe, only prayer and patience, and both failed often. At night, when they undressed just enough to lie by the fire, the sores sometimes burst. A warm trickle ran down their legs, sticky and hot before cooling in the air. They did not cry out. The sound would wake others, and shame was worse than pain. In the morning, they cleaned what they could with dry cloths, then pulled the same garments over their wounds and began the day again. Some bled through their clothes, and the stains froze before anyone noticed. The infection spread silently, the smell deepening with every passing week. When the cold was at its worst, the body lost its strength to fight. Fevers came and went without pattern. A woman might faint by the hearth and wake believing it was hunger, not sickness. Death came without spectacle. The body cooled, the sores blackened, and life simply slipped away. There is something deeply unsettling in how their suffering became so ordinary that no one thought it needed a name. Those who survived until spring bore the scars when the thaw arrived, and they finally dared to undress fully. They found their skin discoloured, peeling, or fused where wounds had healed poorly. Some were horrified at what they saw, others turned away in quiet acceptance. The body was no longer theirs to judge. It had done its duty, keeping them alive through the cold, no matter the cost. Even the air outside seemed cruel when it touched those wounds for the first time. The sting of freshness was sharper than any knife. It reminded them of what they had endured, of the filth they had carried like a second soul. They washed carefully, afraid to rub too hard, watching as the water turned grey and red at their feet. For a moment, the pain felt almost sacred, proof that they were still alive. But as the next winter approached, the same pattern began again. The sores returned with the cold, because the same layers of clothing returned, the same stillness, the same silence. No one spoke of prevention because no one believed it possible. The cold was stronger than all knowledge. To stay warm meant to stay covered, and to stay covered meant to rot quietly. They endured without complaint, their bodies breaking in places they could not see, their skin giving way to the season's cruelty. By the time the frost lifted, some could no longer walk without limping, yet they still thanked God for letting them live through another winter. Survival was their only triumph, even if it left them marked by wounds that never truly healed. In those long frozen months, pain became invisible, woven into the rhythm of breathing and working. The sores beneath the fabric were not signs of sickness, but symbols of endurance. They proved that the body could decay and still obey. Yet behind that endurance, something darker waited, something that would reveal just how thin the line was between survival and slow death. There was a story that spread through a quiet village, carried by whispers rather than voices. It told of a woman who died not from the cold itself, but from what the cold had forced her to endure. She had worn the same layers for too long, the same rags pressed against her skin until they had hardened with blood and discharge. When she finally tried to remove them, the fabric clung like another layer of flesh. The moment she pulled, her skin tore open. The pain was silent at first, then sharp enough to take her breath. She sat near the fire that night, hands trembling, too afraid to ask for help. By morning, the wound had begun to fester. The fabric she had peeled away was stiff, dark, and foul. Beneath it, the raw skin gleamed wet and red. The air in the house filled with the scent of iron and smoke. She tried to bind the wound with a strip of old linen, hoping to stop the bleeding, but the bandage trapped the infection inside. In those cold rooms where no one washed, it took only days for her body to betray her. It is horrifying in a quiet, almost unreal way that something as small as dried cloth could open a door to death. Her husband noticed only when the smell grew unbearable. He thought it came from the hearth, from food left too long by the fire. But when he lifted the blanket, he saw the truth. Her thighs were covered in blackened skin and pus. The wound pulsed faintly, alive with movement. Tiny white larvae had hatched in the dampness, feeding on what was left of her flesh. She had felt them, but said nothing. Shame was heavier than pain. She believed it would pass, like everything else, if she prayed hard enough. When the doctor came, there was little to do. The cold made medicine useless, and the infection had already reached her blood. She drifted between waking and fever, whispering nonsense, her breath sour with decay. The doctor burned her bandages in the hearth, but the smell lingered. He said it was the will of God, though everyone in the room knew it was the will of neglect. If something like this happened in modern times, it would be a headline about preventable suffering. Yet in her world, it was just another winter death. The villagers buried her before the ground froze again. They said she'd been too proud, that she had tried to clean herself when others knew better. No one blamed the cold, or the ignorance, or the silence that had trapped her. They blamed her body, as if it had chosen to rot. Her husband did not speak at the burial. He stood apart, staring at the frozen earth as though he could still smell the wound. For weeks afterward, people swore the scent of rot clung to the path where he walked. In the dimness of that village, her story became a warning. Women whispered to each other that removing the rags too soon was dangerous, that tearing them off could tear the skin as well. They told their daughters to be patient, to wait until the cloth softened again with warmth. The superstition spread, stronger than truth, because truth was harder to face. They would rather believe the body needed to stay sealed than risk what had happened to her. I cannot help but think how fear turns even survival into a ritual of slow destruction. Inside every home that winter, women sat near fires with the same stiffness in their movements, the same quiet dread of what might be happening beneath their clothes. They adjusted their rags gently, careful not to pull too hard. Some prayed each night that their skin would hold another day. They had no words for infection, no understanding of decay beyond the smell it made. The cold preserved their ignorance, freezing both the air and the truth. By the time spring thawed the earth, her name had been forgotten, but her story lingered like smoke in the rafters. The woman still remembered the image of her torn flesh, the larvae crawling where life should have been. It was not horror to them anymore, only a warning. They learned to move more slowly, to clean less, to endure more. They learned that touching one's body could mean death, and so they stopped touching it at all. The body itself became an object of suspicion. Pain was a test of faith, infection, a sign of endurance. Each woman carried the fear of that story in silence, feeling her own wounds burn with recognition. No one said it aloud, but they all knew that what had killed her could come for any of them, in any winter, without sound or mercy. Her death changed nothing. The next season brought the same cold, the same layers, the same stains. Somewhere in the dark, another wound would open, another woman would sit too long by the fire, another husband would notice too late. The cycle continued, buried beneath frost and silence. The story of her torn flesh faded into a kind of superstition, but its truth lived on in every shiver of fear that passed through the women who came after her. And as the wind howled across the empty fields, carrying the scent of smoke and decay, it reminded them that sometimes, in the coldest winters, death began not with sickness, but with the simple act of trying to be clean. In the depths of medieval winter, a woman's dress was more than clothing. It was a shield against death. Every layer she wore held the faint warmth of her body, and to remove it, even for a moment, was to invite the cold inside. The air itself seemed hungry, ready to bite at any inch of exposed flesh. So she did not undress, not for washing, not for comfort, not even for sleep. The fabric clung to her skin day after day, stiff with sweat, soot, and the faint sourness of trapped air. To stay dressed was to stay alive. The body beneath the cloth no longer belonged to her, it belonged to the season. Each layer was a barrier, but also a cage. Wool, linen, and fur pressed tightly against one another, sealing in heat, but also sealing in dampness. Beneath them, the skin softened until it felt like wax. The constant rubbing of cloth against flesh left red patches that turned to sores, yet the layers stayed. To lift a skirt meant letting cold air strike like a blade. It was better to bear the pain than to risk the chill. It is almost bitterly amusing that the same dresses that symbolized modesty also trapped rot against their bodies like burial shrouds worn in life. The women worked and slept in those same layers, their movements slow and heavy. When they knelt by the fire, steam rose faintly from their skirts, the moisture drawn out for a moment before sinking back into the fabric. The warmth never lasted long. At night, they lay down, still clothed. The fabric twisted and creased, holding the day's sweat close to the skin. Even dreams smelled of smoke and damp wool. The fabric became part of them, the only thing separating life from the frost creeping in through the cracks of the walls. Some garments were never washed until spring. The outer layers grew shiny with grease from cooking, and the inner ones darkened from the body's oils. The weight of them pulled on the shoulders, dragging with every step, yet no one complained. It was the only way to keep the cold at bay. If one were to imagine such a life now, it would be like sleeping, working, and sweating in the same heavy coat for months, unable to take it off because the air itself wanted you dead. The layers were protection, but also punishment. When the infection came, it started quietly. The dampness between the layers never dried, and small wounds beneath the fabric festered unseen. The smell grew stronger, but in a world already filled with stench, it meant little. A woman might notice a sore that refused to heal, but there was no solution. To expose it to air would mean stripping, and stripping meant death. So she let it stay covered, bound in heat and decay. The wound deepened each day, as if the body itself were trying to rot its way free from the cloth. The dresses were thick, but not kind. The seams rubbed the skin raw, and the laces left marks like bruises. Underneath, The sweat gathered until it dripped slowly down the spine, soaking the inner linen and freezing there when the fire died out. They learned to sit still to conserve warmth, to breathe shallowly so as not to let the body lose heat through the mouth. Each movement was measured, each breath precious. To them, the body was not something to be cared for, but to be contained. I find it quietly tragic that survival demanded they wear their suffering like a second skin, invisible yet constant. There were moments when the urge to remove a layer became overwhelming. The fabric scratched, the smell turned sour, and the weight of the cloth felt unbearable. But then a gust of cold wind would slip through the door, and the thought vanished. The fear of cold was stronger than disgust. It ruled their habits, shaped their silence. Even when the body ached, even when sores bled through the linen, they told themselves it was better to endure. Warmth was life, and filth was the price of it. By late winter, the layers were stiff with dirt and smoke, standing almost on their own when taken off for repair. Some women patched holes with scraps of old cloth without removing the garments completely, stitching them while still wearing them. Their fingers worked through the folds, mending without sight, guided by memory. The new patches only added to the weight. Each repair made the dress thicker, heavier, and less forgiving, until it felt like carrying the season itself on their backs. When the first thaw came, they undressed for the first time in months. The air that touched their skin burned. Some wept, not from relief but from the pain of the cold against their open pores. Their skin was pale, damp and bruised, their hair matted to their necks. The sores beneath their clothing had turned dark, the edges cracked and oozing. They stood in silence, staring at the marks the winter had left on their bodies, as if seeing themselves for the first time. The dirt came off in layers, but the smell lingered. For many, this moment of freedom was short-lived. The same clothes were soon washed and worn again, and the same habits returned. The cold would come back, and with it, the need to survive. Cleanliness was a luxury that the weather did not allow. To live through the frost meant to surrender the body to it, to accept that warmth came with decay. They endured, wrapped in their heavy armour of fabric, carrying warmth, filth, and pain together in silence. The air outside promised death, the layers promised life, and there was no space between them. When the frost finally began to retreat, the women who had survived were changed. They had worn their bodies into numbness, and now something far worse was waiting beneath that stillness, something the winter had hidden but not destroyed. In the frozen houses of the medieval winter, there was no true place for privacy. The cold ruled over comfort, and even the simplest act of relieving oneself became a matter of survival. In the centre of the single dim room where families slept, ate, and prayed, stood a wooden bucket. It was crude, dark with stains, and always half full. That bucket was their toilet, their basin, their night companion. When nature called, no one left the warmth of the hearth to brave the wind outside. They crouched beside the bucket instead, lifting their layers of wool and linen just enough to manage what needed to be done. The sound of liquid meeting wood was as common as the crackling fire. When the bucket filled, it was emptied only when the cold allowed. Often the contents froze solid before anyone bothered to throw them out. Urine was not seen as waste, it was a useful thing. Women saved it for washing hands, cleaning stains, or soaking cloth stiff with grease. The acid smell filled the house, but no one flinched. It was the scent of survival. It is grimly absurd that in those dark winters, the liquid meant to clean their hands came from their own bodies. They believed it disinfected, and in truth, it sometimes did better than the filthy water from the wells. At night, the bucket sat closest to the fire. The heat from the hearth kept it from freezing, but it also made the smell rise into the air. Smoke from burning wood mixed with the sour tang of urine, wrapping the room in a heavy odour that clung to hair, skin, and fabric. Children slept only a few feet away, and in the morning they would stir the ashes with their hands before eating. The smell was so constant that it no longer belonged to filth, it belonged to home. When sickness came, the bucket became the only tool of comfort. The weak could not walk outside, and the cold would have killed them if they tried. They relieved themselves where they lay, and someone else, often a woman, cleaned after them. A handful of straw was thrown over the waste to hide the sight and the smell. Sometimes the straw froze to the floorboards, creating small patches of filth that no one could scrub away until spring. If one compares this to modern life, it would be like sleeping, eating, and relieving oneself all within the same few square feet, and calling it normal. It was not neglect, it was adaptation. In the deepest cold, even the effort of moving to the bucket became too much. People urinated where they slept, especially the old and the young. They lined their bedding with straw or old cloth to soak up the moisture, then replaced it every few days. The warmth of the liquid brought brief comfort before the cold took it away. By morning, the bedding would be stiff with frost, the smell sharp and sour. No one complained. They simply added more straw and went on. The floorboards of those houses told stories of years of living this way. The wood darkened with stains that no cleaning could erase. Each winter added a new layer of scent, of decay, of use. When spring came, the melting frost carried the smell outside, spreading through the village until every breeze carried a hint of it. The first warm days were always the worst. The ice melted, and the stench that had been locked away for months came back to life. Women were the keepers of this hidden ritual. They emptied the buckets when they could, carrying them outside before dawn. Their hands froze around the handles, and the wind whipped the smell into their faces. Some poured the contents near the edge of the fields. Others saved the urine for washing, believing it cleansed better than soap. The mixture of waste and frost hardened into the soil, marking the ground with the memory of each winter's endurance. To the villagers, this was not disgusting but necessary. There were no outhouses in deep snow, no wells that stayed clean enough to waste on washing. The body provided, and the body reused. They believed nature gave all it could, even in its most unpleasant forms. The same hand that fed the fire also held the bucket. There was no shame in that. They had learned to blur the line between what was pure and what was foul, because survival demanded it. I find it both fascinating and disturbing how need can erase disgust so completely that filth becomes routine. When visitors from warmer regions came, they recoiled from the smell, unable to eat or sleep in such air. But those who lived there did not notice it at all. The senses dulled over time, softening what might have once caused revulsion. They lived by a simple rule: anything that kept them warm was good. Anything that risked cold was evil. Cleanliness fell on the side of evil. The bucket in the centre of the room was a symbol of that choice, a reminder that dignity meant little when frost could take a life overnight. By the end of winter, when the bucket's wood began to crack from use, it was often burned for warmth. The act felt almost sacred, as if the season's suffering was being given back to the fire. But even as the smoke rose, its smell carried the memory of what it had held. The ashes were swept aside, and a new bucket was carved before the next frost came. The room stayed the same, the air stayed thick, the cycle repeated, unbroken by shame or change. And as the snow fell again, each household returned to its quiet rhythm, carrying warmth, waste, and silence in the same breath, never questioning which was which. The air of medieval winter was thick with human scent. It clung to walls, soaked into clothing, and lived in the hair of everyone who breathed it. The smell of unwashed bodies was not something to be hidden or discussed. It was part of life itself. People carried their own scent the way they carried their names. The mixture of sweat, smoke, and damp cloth formed a background that no one noticed anymore. To them, it was not filth, but familiarity. The sharp tang of bodies pressed close to fires, the sourness of stale breath, the faint burn of dried fat, all of it wove together into the fabric of survival. The rich and poor alike shared this invisible burden. No rank could protect against it. The noblewoman who wore silk carried the same odour beneath her gown as the milkmaid who cleaned the stables. The difference was only that the noblewoman could hide hers behind perfumes imported from faraway lands. She sprayed her skin and hair with oils of rose and amber, masking the must of mould that grew beneath her layers. It is almost bitterly humorous, that luxury. Instead of erasing the smell of decay, simply made it more expensive. The perfume mixed with sweat and smoke until it created a scent both sweet and rotten. Something uniquely human and entirely medieval. Inside the homes, the air never changed. The smoke from the hearth filled the room and lingered in every fold of fabric. It mixed with the odour of skin and waste until the two became indistinguishable. Children grew up breathing it, their senses trained to ignore it before they could speak. They slept beside their parents, surrounded by the smells of milk, blood, and excrement, learning early that these were not signs of dirt but of warmth. In a world where the cold could kill overnight, the smell of life, no matter how foul, was comforting. The body's odour told stories. A sour scent meant fever, a sharp, metallic one hinted at bleeding, a musty one spoke of long nights without rest. Yet no one recoiled. To comment on such things would have been as strange as commenting on the weather. The human smell was everywhere, in churches, in markets, in beds. Even the air outside carried hints of sweat and smoke, carried on the breath of 100 people packed into narrow streets. If one were to imagine it today, it would be like walking through a city where everyone shared the same scent of exhaustion and called it home. In the coldest months, the smell grew stronger. Fires burned constantly, and the fat used for candles and cooking added its greasy sweetness to the air. Clothing was never washed, so each layer held the memory of every meal, every movement, every night spent sweating by the hearth. The odour of the living blended with that of the dying. Sickness and warmth shared the same space. To bathe or change was unthinkable, so the body simply accepted itself. The skin thickened, the nose adapted, and the line between clean and unclean disappeared. Even churches, the supposed sanctuaries of purity, were filled with it. The scent of wax, rot, and human closeness drifted through the pews. When people knelt in prayer, the air grew heavier, a mix of devotion and decay. Priests swung censers filled with incense, not only as symbols of holiness, but as desperate attempts to overpower the smell of the congregation. It never worked. The incense only added another layer to the odour that defined their world. The wealthy turned scent into status. Perfume was worn not for pleasure but for survival. They believed certain oils could protect against disease, and that sweet smells could keep illness away. Women dabbed scent on their wrists, their hair, and even on the mouldy fabric beneath their breasts, hoping it would stop the spread of rot. I find it strangely fascinating that they tried to fight the reality of their bodies with fragrance, turning fear into fashion. The more expensive the scent, the greater the illusion of health. But beneath the perfume, the same human smell endured, relentless and true. For the poor, there was no such mask. They smelled of wood smoke, dirt, and sweat. Their homes reeked of animals, of damp straw, of the waste bucket in the corner. Yet even among them, the odour did not inspire disgust. It was simply the smell of survival, the proof that life persisted through the frost. When travellers entered their homes and recoiled, they laughed quietly. To them, the visitors smelled strange, empty, almost cold. Cleanliness was unfamiliar, even suspicious. By the time the frost began to melt, the human smell had become part of the season. It clung to everything, carried by the rising warmth. When the first rains came, they washed some of it away, but never all. It lingered in walls and hair, in the cracks of furniture and the grain of wood. The scent of the living had marked everything, refusing to fade. To live in that time was to breathe humanity in its rawest form, without distance, without disguise. Their scent was their history, their environment, their curse, and their comfort. The world smelled of itself, and no one questioned it. The winter ended, but the odour remained, heavy and familiar, the truest sign that they had survived. And within that survival lay another truth still hidden, waiting for the warmth to uncover what the stench had kept secret through the long frozen months. The story began with a smell. It came before the screams, before the prayers, before the silence that followed. In a small village buried under snow, the neighbours noticed a strange odour seeping through the cracks of a wooden door. It was not the familiar stench of smoke or waste, but something thicker, heavier, something that clung to the throat. When they found her, she was still warm to the touch, her body limp, her eyes half open as if she had only just fallen asleep. Yet the air around her was already sour with decay. Death had moved faster than the frost. They prepared her for burial in the dim light of the house. The women who came to wash her body recoiled when they lifted her dress. The skin beneath her waist was discoloured, soft, and foul. When they pressed a cloth to it, it tore away easily, leaving a dark liquid on the floor. The smell deepened, thick enough to make their eyes water. Her stomach had begun to swell, though the rest of her body was still thin. The priest said it was the will of God, but the villagers whispered among themselves. They said she'd been too dirty inside, that her body had rotted from within. It is strangely chilling that they feared impurity more than death, as if filth itself could summon the grave. The truth was simpler. Weeks of infection had eaten through her from the lower belly down. The winter had hidden the signs. She had carried a fever quietly, her body burning while her skin stayed cold to the touch. The layers of cloth that trapped warmth also trapped sickness, sealing it close to her flesh until it turned against her. When she died, it was not from age or hunger, but from the body's slow surrender to its own poisons. No one knew enough to see it coming, and even if they had, there was nothing they could have done. When the women tried to wash her, they found their clothes useless. Every touch opened a new wound. The smell filled the room, creeping into the beams, the floor, the straw of the bedding. It was a smell that did not belong to death alone, but to life that had been forced to rot in silence. If this were to happen today, it would be the work of doctors and medicine. But in her time, it was simply another story of the cold claiming a body. The villagers could not bear to keep her indoors any longer. Before the body had even stiffened, they wrapped her in a sheet and carried her into the frozen yard. The ground was as hard as stone. The men dug with numb hands, breaking through the frost while the women stood at a distance, clutching their cloaks over their mouths. The priest murmured prayers, his voice lost in the wind. When they lowered her into the hole, steam rose faintly from the body, mixing with the chill air. They covered her quickly, fearful that the smell might spread sickness to the living. By the time the grave was filled, the scent still lingered, curling through the cold like a warning. For days after, no one went near her house. The smell had soaked into the walls. Her husband moved to his brother's farm, leaving everything behind. Some said he could still feel the warmth of her body when they buried her, that she had not yet been fully dead. Others whispered that her insides had turned to rot before her soul could leave. They did not see illness as natural, but as a punishment, a sign that she had failed to keep her body pure. I find it deeply unsettling how quickly fear turns the human body into something shameful once it begins to decay. As the weeks passed, the story changed shape. Children were told to keep clean or suffer the same fate. Women washed their hands with snow and scrubbed their faces with ash, believing it would drive out whatever evil had taken her. But no one truly understood. They did not know that the infection had begun months before, deep inside her, while she worked, prayed, and slept beside the fire. The cold had preserved her long enough to hide the rot, and when warmth returned, it revealed what had been waiting beneath. When spring finally came and the snow began to melt, animals dug near her grave. The men found the earth